Hello, Garland Nixon here with Dr. Gerald Horne. Big week we've got here with the BRICS meeting and all kinds of interesting things going on. I have some questions for Dr. Horne that I'm sure he'll be able to answer. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne is a researcher. He's a historian. He's a professor. He's the author of upwards of 30 books, and he was raised in St. Louis, Missouri. He has an undergraduate education at Princeton. He received his PhD from Columbia and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Cal Berkeley. Dr. Horne, welcome back. Certainly, thank you. Post-critical hour, our first interview.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, let's get started here. One of the questions I wanted to ask, and there's a lot to talk about the BRICS, but this is the first thing on my mind: Turkey, the nemesis of one President Erdogan, who was alleged to have been involved in I believe, a 2016 move to throw him out of, to coup him in office. Also, allegations that U.S. imperialism had a hand in that. Hiding out in Pennsylvania as I believe he seems to have passed away. Turkey is moving. They're in NATO. They're looking at getting in BRICS. What do you make of all of this, Dr. Horne?
Well, first of all, with regard to the passing of the opponent of President Erdogan, speaking of Fethullah Gulen, 83 years old, in exile in the Poconos in Pennsylvania, accused by Mr. Erdogan of being behind the attempted 2016 coup, which barely failed. I mean, it had substantial support in the military. The military was bombing. They were planning to kidnap Mr. Erdogan. It was a very serious attempt. And of course, he pointed the finger of accusation at Washington because I've been accused of being soft on Ankara. And I'm going to own up to that because I've been trying to give President Erdogan a fair amount of slack, despite his being the eastern flank of NATO, despite his supplying drones to the Kiev regime to attack Russia. I think the issue is that Mr. Erdogan, he's all over the place. Ankara is all over the place. For example, at the same time he is the eastern flank of NATO, he apparently is applying to the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. At the same time, he has been supplying military materiel to Ukraine. He's been engaged in a robust trade relationship with Russia. And perhaps the ultimate aspect of his being all over the place, or if you like, his double dealing and being two-faced, comes to Israel, for example, where he's spoken in harsh terms about the Zionist state. The regime has hosted the various leaders of Hamas over the years. Hamas has been close historically to the Muslim Brotherhood, which Mr. Erdogan and his so-called AKP party sees itself as a kindred spirit of the Muslim Brotherhood. But perhaps the ultimate double dealing, and he, of course, is a master of this, comes with regard to his policy in Syria, where initially he and President al-Assad of Damascus were as close as lips and teeth. They used to vacation together. That was during the era of Ankara's policy of zero problems with neighbors. But then he turned on Mr. al-Assad and began aligning with religious zealots. But now he's done another reversal and apparently is backing away from the religious zealots. And if that is too dizzying for your taste, let's return to Israel. Because what's happening now is that Ankara has been very close to the regime in Azerbaijan. And there hangs a tale, because Azerbaijan, as you know, was a former Soviet republic, and part of the nonfeasance of the corporate media is not pointing to the reality that when the Soviet Union was dismantled, a victor to a degree was not only China, which was able to establish positive relations with former Soviet republics in Central Asia, including the Stans, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, all of which are energy rich, but also Turkey, which of course has bonded with Baku, with Azerbaijan, on the basis of so-called Turkishness, on the basis of the Islamic faith. And so you may recall that in the last 24 months or so, there was a sharp clash between Azerbaijan and neighboring Armenia. And of course, Armenia is also, I would argue, a victim of the dismantling of the Soviet Union, because it left that predominantly Christian nation surrounded by historic foes, including Turkey, which, as you know, more than a century ago perpetrated a genocide against Yerevan, against Armenia. And when Azerbaijan routed Armenia in the last 24 months over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, it helped to set in motion a chain of events that's led ultimately to the Israelis getting closer to Azerbaijan at the same time that Turkey, which supposedly is hostile to Israel, is close to Azerbaijan. And we also see that just as Israel has been bombing Christian villages in Lebanon, it's also been complicit in the routing of so-called Christian Armenia. And part of this has to do with the fact that Nagorno-Karabakh, aforementioned, is close in proximity to Iran. And it is now suspected that if Israel moves forward with attacking Iran, which we expect any day, if not any moment, that part of the offense will be launched perhaps from the jurisdiction of Azerbaijan, where, as noted, Turkey supposedly plays a pivotal role, whereas noted, Turkey supposedly is hostile to Israel. And so the double dealing is just dizzying, as noted. But what usually happens, I'm afraid to tell President Erdogan, is that when you cross so many different countries, and I haven't even gotten into his dealings with Finland and Sweden over NATO admission, where at first he was against it, before he was for it, and he was charging that both Stockholm and Helsinki were housing political opponents of his, particularly Kurdish political opponents, which was likely the case. But ultimately, what usually happens when you're repeatedly stabbing folks in the back and then pulling the knife out and patting them on the back is that it usually ends badly. So Turkey is a very tricky nation, but I think it's getting in well over its head. And therefore, we're going to have to watch what unfolds there very carefully. But I really can't hesitate. I can't wait any longer to talk about some of the big news. And it's not only the BRICS meeting, which the mainstream press is paying a fair amount of attention to, particularly showing the lack of isolation of Moscow with Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, applicants knocking down the door to join this BRICS formation, which has very ambitious plans, ultimately for de-dollarization, although that's not on the immediate agenda. But certainly it's one of the stiffer challenges to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions, now long in the tooth at 80 years of age, So that's obviously a significant story. But I think the big news coming out of Kazan in Russia, which, as you know, is taking place in the predominantly Muslim part of Russia, which I think is a tip of the hat of Moscow to its role as a sort of protector of the so-called global South, is what might happen on the sidelines. Because in the last 24 hours, there has been an announcement of an entente between China and India. That's really been a spanner in the works. The fact that relations between these two Asian giants has not been ideal. Recall that they clashed sharply alongst their 2,000 plus mile border in 2020, leading to a number of deaths, that they fought a brief war in 1962. But now, at least according to Indian press reports, they're moving to some sort of resolution. And this is huge news because, number one, it calls into question the Quad, this US-backed alliance, including United States, Japan, Australia, and India, that's supposedly going to encircle China. It calls into question the role of the Philippines, the former US colony, which has been jousting with Chinese forces in the South China Sea. It even questions the role of Pakistan, because Pakistan has been a long-term close ally of China, in part based upon mutual antipathy towards New Delhi. But if relations between Delhi and Beijing are improving, particularly in the context of repeated attacks by certain Pakistani zealots upon Chinese workers involved in various projects in Pakistan, it may leave Pakistan out on a limb as well. Certainly, it burnishes the profile of Moscow, which has ideal relations with both Delhi and Beijing. And this is very profound and significant news. And just like the aforementioned news about the moves towards de-dollarization, albeit with baby steps, albeit tentatively, ultimately calls into question the viability of the US dollar. And to bring it home, if we're not careful, many with fixed incomes in this country who are dependent upon, for example, pensions and Social Security checks might find that their hypothetical $6,000 a month, which nowadays, I guess you could say, is not necessarily chump change, but it could quickly become chump change if there's a run on the dollar, if the dollar loses altitude, if the dollar loses value, and you're on a fixed dollar income. This may be all in motion in light of what's happening in Kazan, which is all the more reason why listeners and viewers should be tuning in to Garland Nixon so that they can prepare for what might very well be a perilous future.
Now, I also understand that I saw that on the sidelines, Presidents Putin and Xi were meeting. President Putin met with, I believe, Mohammed bin, the leader of Zayed, the leader of the UAE.
UAE, correct?
Yeah, yes. What do you think about these side meetings going on? Is there anything that you have heard about them, or you have any thoughts on them?
Well, UAE, in a sense, is emulating Turkey. For example, MBZ, the titular leader of the UAE, he was in the Oval Office just about 10 or 15 days ago, communing with President Biden, and now he's chummy with President Putin. Now, I'm sure he would say that this is just normal diplomatic relations, but the UAE also needs to be careful. And I say that because they are attracting a lot of negative attention, particularly because of their role in Africa, their involvement up to their eyeballs in the conflict in Sudan, where they have been accused credibly of supporting the rebellious wing of the Sudanese military, which is fighting the Sudanese military. They've been accused credibly of being a kind of transmission belt for the Israeli economy, which has been suffering serious blows because of the outflow of dual passport holders, 40,000 of whom, of course, carry U.S. passports in Israel. And they've been flooding out, particularly into Cyprus, by the way, driving up housing prices in that particular country. I have not received a report to this effect, but I would imagine Israelis are flooding into Malta as well, which happens to be part of the European Union, and given certain migration protocols would then allow these Israelis to travel within the EU. And so the UAE is a relatively small nation and has a large expatriate community, particularly of South Asian workers. And despite its closeness to US imperialism, Washington might not necessarily be happy with it joining with the BRICS. I think that's one of the reasons why Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, MBS, is not attending the BRICS meeting. Apparently, they're sending the foreign minister because they're trying to play their own double game. Recall that MBS has had some rather important meetings with President Putin in the last 12 to 24 months. At the same time, Saudi Arabia depends upon the United States supposedly for its security. But there hangs a tail, because when you say that Saudi Arabia is depending upon US imperialism for security, usually that points to their longtime conflict with Iran. But in light of the rapprochement brokered by China between Iran and Saudi Arabia, relations between this predominantly Sunni nation, speaking of Saudi Arabia, predominantly Shia nation, speaking of Iran, have improved tremendously, which probably lessens the importance of these security agreements with Washington. And so this will also give Saudi Arabia more latitude with regard to standing firm concerning Israel, because the scuttlebutt was that before October 7th, 2023, Saudi Arabia was moving to normalize relations with Israel. That would have opened the door for other members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, including these per capita wealthy nations like UAE, Qatar, for example, to do the same. But in light of the post-October 7th, 2023 events, it seems that normalization is off the table with regard to Saudi Arabia and Israel. Riyadh has said that it's looking forward to Palestinian statehood with a capital in East Jerusalem. If you look at the configuration of the Israeli leadership today, with the strength of the right wing, with the strength of those who have been described credibly as fascists, the prospect of that so-called two-state solution does not seem like it's in the immediate offing, and particularly in light of the fact that Israel turning into a kind of murder incorporated, assassinating Hamas leaders and assassinating Hezbollah leaders, etc. As a matter of fact, one of the most dangerous jobs today seems to be negotiating with the Israelis, because what happens is they wind up killing the people they're negotiating with. And so in light of all this, it seems to me that there's going to be increasing pressure on these so-called Gulf monarchies, including the UAE, including the Saudis in particular, because their populaces are quite upset, as many of us are, with the live stream genocide coming from Gaza, increasingly coming from the West Bank and Lebanon. And that's going to put increasing pressure upon these regimes. And I'm not sure if MBZ, for example, breaking bread with Putin, which of course I'm not opposed to, but I'm not sure if that's going to be entirely satisfactory to what's colloquially called the Arab Street, which could lead to his perhaps seeking a place of exile, speaking of MBZ, sooner rather than later.
One of the interesting things I read a lot in Russian media today about BRICS, and one of the things that a recurring theme was the global South. That it came across as though they felt that it was critical to engage the global South, to build up the global. Literally, they said build up the global South. Your thoughts on the focus, with Russia as president, the focus on, it seems to me, returning to the Soviet Union legacy of anti-imperialism in the global South, kind of like a vision that now, since we have revisited a Cold War 2.0 on steroids, maybe even a hot war, it seems to me, you want the Russians argue that it is in fact a hot war, that they are in fact at war with NATO and not a proxy army. The Russians, it seems to be decision to go back to the roots, to really ally. Like, let me put it a different way. Seems to be that U.S. imperialism has a full spectrum war on them, and they have a full spectrum defense. And an intricate, important part of that is their alliances, both diplomatic, economic, and even military, with global South, Africa, Latin America, and it seems to be particularly Africa. Your thoughts?
Well, I'm glad you raised that question, because recall that I mentioned a moment or two ago that with the dismantling of the Soviet Union, you had the voices of U.S. imperialism spitting on the grave of the USSR, charging that we've reached the end of history, that it's the era of the sole remaining superpower. But one of the things I find striking and remarkable about the United States, and particularly its propagandists, are even those who are, at least on paper, opposed to U.S. propaganda, that few mention the salient reality that in contemplating the rise of China, you cannot do that without contemplating the demise of the Soviet Union. That is to say, about a half century ago, Nixon and Kissinger brokered an anti-Soviet deal with China, which then led to massive foreign direct investment in Beijing. U.S. imperialism apparently thought that China was going to be their low-wage haven forevermore, and it led to the figurative, if not literal, dismantling of U.S. factories and shipped across the Pacific to China. Interestingly enough, one of the key figures in that whole charade was the former leader of the United Auto Workers, speaking of Leonard Woodcock, who was appointed ambassador to China. And a good deal of the movement of factories took place during his tenure, which is an ironic position for a union leader to be in. And so we now see, at least many of us see, apparently the propagandists are still celebrating the demise of the Soviet Union and have not awakened to today's reality as to how that led directly to the rise of China. And so now we see China spearheading the BRICS in conjunction with Russia. And as you suggested, they are encroaching, if I can use that verb, on the erstwhile preserve of North Atlantic imperialism in Africa. Because let's face it, as scholars too numerous to mention, but including the late Eric Williams, founding father of modern Trinidad, in his book Capitalism and Slavery, the late Walter Rodney of neighboring Guyana in his book How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and the man still in the land of the living, speaking of Nigeria's Joseph Nkorie, in his book England and the Industrial Revolution, you cannot begin to explain the superpower status of the United States of America without reference to the African slave trade. You cannot begin to understand the rise of the British Empire without contemplating the plundering and pillaging, not only of India, but of Africa. And now that's under a sharp assault. You see that with regard to the alliance of Sahel states, speaking of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, formerly considered part and parcel of French neo-colonialism. Not so much. You see it with regard to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which unfolded in Beijing just a few weeks ago, with dozens of African heads of state and government communing in China, going home with bags of goodies, including the continuation of building of airports and railways, such as the railway from Mombasa on the Indian Ocean coast to the capital that is Nairobi, or railways in Ethiopia. That when Vice President Harris flew to Africa some months ago, that every airport landed in, be it in Ghana, be it in Zambia, be it in Tanzania, they were all designed and or built by Chinese interests. We keep hearing that Mr. Biden, his final trip as president, will be to Angola, Southwest Africa. And of course, one of the reasons he's going to that oil-rich, diamond-rich Southwest African state is not only because of those aforementioned assets, but also because Angola is one of China's closest allies on the African continent. And besides, U.S. imperialism is seeking leverage against South Africa, which it's upset with because of South Africa dragging U.S. ally Israel into the dock of the International Court of Justice, where it was pronounced accurately that there's a plausible case for genocide to be made out by this U.S. ally. And of course, a major aider and abettor of this ally is, of course, Washington itself. And if the principles traditionally of criminal justice are to be pursued, then the companion case apparently being pursued in the International Criminal Court against Mr. Netanyahu, he, of course, has murdered all of the Palestinians who were supposed to be dragged into court alongside him. Then it seems to me that there are some in Washington who need to be dragged into the International Criminal Court on the basis of being aiders and abettors. And so we see at the end of the day that despite its plotting, despite its depredations, the crisis of U.S. imperialism has not abated one whit. And as this summit in Kazan, Russia unfolds, I dare say that historians of the future may look back at October 2024 as being a moment when the crisis was hastened. It reminds me of the famous line from the late U.S. novelist Ernest Hemingway, when asked about one of his characters in one of his books, how they became bankrupt. He said it was a process that was gradual, then sudden. And so you can say the same about U.S. imperialism. There's been a gradual nature of the crisis of U.S. imperialism, and October 2024 might mark the point, and I would say likely marks the point, when the crisis deepens and can fairly be said to mark a sudden downturn in the already unsteady fortunes of U.S. imperialism.
Turning a little bit of different direction inward. So it's a couple of different things I want to talk about. There's some things that questions I want to have about the occupied Palestine conflict. But as you know, as you already mentioned, for these last 6 or 7 years, I've been doing shows on Radio Sputnik. We had, you were on there times too numerous to mention. Great, a lot of great work done on there. And the 2 weeks before the election, interestingly, the United States, U.S. government decided to reinterpret their sanctions in a manner that closed Radio Sputnik. They also said that, interestingly enough, when Tony Blinken had his press conference just before they shut down African Stream and numerous other things, they said that the reason that I'm paraphrasing, but the reason that people were no longer the reason that Ukraine is bleeding support is because of the effectiveness of Russia's uh, propaganda through RT and Sputnik. I might add, in Europe, RT and Sputnik are illegal, so people mostly can't really see them. They have to find sneaky ways. In the U.S., RT was and Sputnik were both really only available on Rumble. Few people see, and of course through our radio station in Washington D.C. and Kansas City. But it seems to me they couldn't admit the real reasons that support is bleeding. Your thoughts on the crackdowns going on, and that shut down Sputnik, RT, African Stream, Uhuru, Scott Ritter, on and on. Your thoughts?
Well, obviously, the Biden team made a strategic mistake when they got involved in this escapade in Ukraine. Recall that his predecessor, his former supervisor, Mr. Obama, suggested during his tenure that since Russia had what he called escalatory dominance, it would be unwise to get involved in this sort of military scrape with Moscow. I don't think that so-called Russian propaganda is the explanatory device shedding light upon why Ukraine seems to be crumbling and in full retreat. I think it has more to do with the fact that Russia's population is about 3 times the size of that of Ukraine, 50 million Ukraine, 150 million plus of Russia. I think it has more to do with the aforementioned alliances that Moscow has been able to broker, not least with the People's Republic of China. Or, for example, if you look at the trade figures from former Soviet republics, such as Kazakhstan, for example, you'll see that since the special military operation of 2022 February, that their trade has skyrocketed. And there are those who suspect that Kazakhstan and the other stands are just a transmission belt. That is to say, trading with Germany, and then the goods are transported from Kazakhstan into Russia. And so Washington has problems admitting when it has made strategic blunders. Recall my previous comment about how little discussion there is about the strategic blunder of building up China in order to support in Moscow, and then you create this Leviathan in China, this juggernaut that bids fair to leave U.S. imperialism sprawling in the dust. And therefore, what happens, instead of doing a sober assessment, an agonizing analysis, instead, they begin the search for scapegoats. Hence, the harassing of Scott Ritter, the indictment of Chairman O'Malley and the comrades in the African People's Socialist Party, the driving of Sputnik from the radio airwaves, the circumscribing of the reach of RT and of Sputnik in the North Atlantic community. But someone needs to tell these dimwits in Foggy Bottom, and now I understand why the State Department is headquartered in Foggy Bottom, since they're engaged routinely in foggy thinking. But someone needs to tell these nitwits and dimwits that they are making strategically unsound decisions, and that only tend to hasten the crisis and exacerbate and worsen the crisis of U.S. imperialism, and that putting Chairman O'Malley behind bars, which is their intention, casting Sputnik into purgatory, it will not end the crisis. It is a useless gesture in terms of their overall ambition and goals. But that analysis is very difficult for U.S. imperialism to absorb, I'm afraid to say.
Um, uh, I do want to get to, we've got some time. I do definitely want to get back to the Middle East, but something I want to ask you about and as you know, I'm a third party person and have been for some time. I was a Bernie Sanders. I used to be a Democrat, was a Bernie Sanders supporter. And when that whole debacle went down, I left the party. And now I've decided I'm going to vote for, I no bones about it. I'm voting for Jill Stein and Butch Ware. That's the direction I'm going right now. I'm a third party person. And, I have written in the ghost of Abraham Lincoln and the ghost of Hugo Chavez. But this time, no ghost will be written in. I'm going to go with them for a number of reasons. That have to do with the conflict in the Middle East. But every time I think that the Biden administration, the Democratic Party, has done the stupidest thing they can possibly do, they outdo themselves. Kamala Harris is marching around with the Lynn Cheney saying that she's thanking Dick Cheney for his contributions and his work, his service, I guess, to U.S. imperialism. Barack Obama, they find out that Black men are, not supporting her. And to be quite frank, I have a lot of that are Black men, obviously. And what I hear more than anything else is, as the guy in New York said, the rent's too damn high. There are people that are upset about people, when it comes down to it, people vote their pocketbooks. And if a incumbent party is in power and the prices go up, I don't care who's running and who's not, that incumbent party is not going to hold office. And that's what I hear. It's too, the gas is too high, this is too high, eggs are too high, chicken wings are too high. You know the story, Dr. Horne. But they march out Barack Obama to admonish Black men for not voting for her. And people I've talked to were, quite frankly, a bit insulted by it. It didn't seem to go over well. Then they bring out this white dudes for Kamala. I mean, what they're doing is like like nails on a chalkboard. And I'm like, Obama's saying you got to vote. You're a Black dude, and I'm mad at you. And the young Black men are like, who this guy? And now it's white dudes for. These people are insane, Dr. Horne. I just don't even know what they're doing anymore.
Well, they may not know what they're doing either. Certainly, I was disappointed in Mr. Obama, who has styled himself during his administration as not the president of Black America, but the president of the United States of America. Fair enough. And so you would think that if he were to do an analysis of the election, and he has distanced himself from a role that he never held, which is president of Black America, you would think he would do an analysis that suggested, well, why aren't more Euro-American women voting for Kamala Harris? Or why aren't more union members voting for Kamala Harris, particularly a Euro-American ancestry? Or why aren't more Euro-American men voting for Kamala Harris? Why are you singling out the constituency, Black men, that at the end of the day, even by the most biased polls, will likely vote for her 7-3, probably 8-2, if not 9-1. And so this was a real head scratcher. And I think that in terms of campaign tactics, Mr. Obama made a mistake. That's why I don't think he's repeated it since he made those unfortunate remarks. And probably the Harris-Walz team was upset with him for going off message and making himself the story, as opposed to Harris-Walz being the story, which then brings us to Liz Cheney. Vice President Harris has suggested that she will appoint Republicans to her cabinet. And that is something, if I'm not mistaken, that Mr. Obama sought to do as well. Certainly, the Republican holdover, Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, could fairly be said to fit that category, at least loosely. And there's really been talk about appointing Liz Cheney as Secretary of State, which I find incredible. I think, at least I hope, that the Harris-Walz team has more moxie than that, which then allows me to circle back to Armenia. How does that fit in, you ask? Well, I have some perhaps dispiriting news for the Harris-Walz team, which is that in a number of these swing states, so-called, that they have not necessarily cracked the 50% level. There are supposedly these undecided voters. How does Armenia fit into this? Well, recall the Bradley effect of 40 odd years ago when the Black mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley, ran for governor of California against George Deukmejian, a proud son of the Armenian American community. And Mr. Bradley was expecting to prevail, although he hardly ever cracked the 50% mark in the polls. Apparently, there were those in the so-called undecided column. It was thought that a significant percentage would break for Mr. Bradley, but it turns out that in this white supremacist right-wing retrograde nation, despite those rather obvious descriptors, there were those who were too embarrassed to mention that they might turn against their normal party of choice, speaking of the Democrats, just like people might be embarrassed to say that they're voting for Mr. Trump. And so they tell the pollster that they're undecided. And if I'm the Harris-Walz team, I would be taking that into account. And of course, if I'm a Harris-Walz supporter, I would likewise be taking that into account. And I say this particularly because given the recent New York Times article on Jill Stein and the Green Party, already you can see that if Mr. Trump somehow manages to prevail on the first Tuesday in November, that the Greens will be the fall guy. Jill Stein and Butch Ware will be the fall guy. However, to dig a little deeper, we also know that even if the Trump forces lose the popular vote, lose the electoral college vote, then the vote that matters will be the equivalent of January 6, 2025, where if history is any guide, they'll be bum rushing the Capitol in order to prevent any defeat for Mr. Trump. I'm not sure how that's going to be blamed on Jill Stein. And if anything, it might cause even the less sober analysts to do an agonizing reappraisal of what they had thought they knew about US politics, because this, if it happens, and I'm hoping that it does not, will be one more sign of this precipitous decline and precipitous crisis of US imperialism.
Well, I'll say this, I've been around a few years and I've never in my life seen the amount of Black people that I know that have had it with the Democrats, that either just are not voting or are voting for Trump. Black men have told, I'm voting for Trump for this reason or that reason. So just anecdotally, I just don't see any way that Harris wins this between ideologically aligning herself with the, she's got an advertisement out with John Bolton in it. She has an advertisement that has, what's his name? Mark Esper, John Bolton, Mike Pence, and I believe Mark Milley, an advertisement. And I think that they have miscalculated and they feel that they can go over and steal some Republican votes. And I just don't think they're going to. I think, to me, I'm seeing that everything's breaking away from the Democrats. The other thing is, here's something interesting too. Just ask you on the Black issue. If, as I suspect from my anecdotal and even from some of the numbers, a lot of Black people either just stay home or some even vote for Trump, that they've had it with the Democrats, and I hear like, they're not doing anything for us, whatever the case may be. What's been often, the Glenn Ford called the Black misleadership class. Of what value are they to the Democrats and the ruling elite? Their job is to Give your job, if you're Hakeem Jeffries or whoever the case may be, is to make sure that the black man and woman on the vote on the street votes for the Democrats. But when the black man and woman on the street have had it with the Democrats for whatever the reason, this this leadership class, their value suddenly to the ruling elite precipitously declines. And, you know, I do a Pacifica radio show in Washington, D.C. And when I talk about the callers, I do not get many calls from callers who are happy with black mayors and president. They're very unhappy with the crop of black politicians right now. Seems to be great disillusionment in the black community. And I would think that their ruling elite leaders will look at them and say, you didn't deliver, and they'll be. Anyway, your thoughts on all that, Dr. Horne?
Well, it reminds me of an article recently in the New York Times reporting on the Al Smith dinner in Manhattan, a fundraiser for the Roman Catholic Church, the diocese in New York City. And Mr. Trump spoke, Vice President Harris sent a videotaped message. And the New York Times reporter went into some detail, reporting on what he saw as Mr. Trump's vulgarity at this dinner featuring the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church. But the reporter also, in a bit of editorializing, which is not unusual for reportage in the New York Times, said that a good deal of Mr. Trump's base were upset with the U.S. ruling elite, and they're not upset with that kind of vulgarity at the table where billionaire Mike Bloomberg was sitting, for example. In other words, to put it in broader historical perspective, what's happened over the past 75 years is that the U.S. ruling class, through McCarthyism, through the Red Scare, through the Cold War, through driving, as we see today, and as noted, seeking to drive Chairman O'Malley into prison, driving left-wing alternatives into purgatory, they opened the door for these right-wing populist upsurges, which is quite dangerous in this country. And I think that's what we're in the middle of, this kind of right-wing populist upsurge. And so when Vice President Harris then feels that she is being bipartisan by building bridges to Liz Cheney and Mark Esper and John Bolton, the folks who have been responsible for one foreign policy disaster after another, were the sons, particularly, and daughters in some cases, of many Trump supporters in Western Pennsylvania and rural Wisconsin, gasped their last breath on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan, thanks to Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney, John Bolton, Mark Esper. And at the same time, you've driven out of business left-wing critiques and left-wing analyses. Well, then you've just cooked up a prescription for a right-wing populist revolt. And that seems to be on offer. Now, I would be happy. I would be gratified more than any of my detractors to be proven mistaken and wrong. And I would urge my many detractors to show that I'm wrong, because I am not necessarily thrilled and overjoyed by a right-wing populist victory, because I don't think that would necessarily be in the best interest of the international community. Because let's face it, with regard to foreign policy, it is probably accurate to say that the Trumpistas will try to build a bridge to Moscow, will probably toss Mr. Zelensky and all of his interchangeable green shirts into the dustbin of history. But that's only half the story, because that will just allow for more support of Mr. Netanyahu in Israel. And of course, there's reason to suspect that Mr. Netanyahu is engaged in activities as we speak that are seeking to prepare the path for Mr. Trump. It would allow Mr. Trump to focus post-January 2025 like a laser beam on the People's Republic of China, which is quite dangerous because, as Vladimir Putin said the other day in his press conference before the BRICS summit, the time to try to destabilize China was 15 years ago. It's really too late, but that sort of reasonable assessment is difficult for U.S. imperialism to absorb. And so I'm afraid to say that whatever the outcome, be it Mr. Trump prevailing or by some stroke of fate, Vice President Harris prevailing, the crisis of U.S. imperialism is not going away anytime soon. It will continue at warp speed. And I know that that's a bitter pill to swallow, but just as Mr. Putin said that the time for imperialism to confront China was 15 years ago, I would also say that the time to steer U.S. imperialism away from its disastrous collision-laden course was more than 15 years ago. And so this is the bitter reality that needs to be absorbed sooner rather than later.
Yeah, we'll be lucky to make it till January 20th at this point. Let me ask you about this, which we've got to discuss this. So Israel, we've had Iran on more than one occasion demonstrate their ability to strike Israel with missiles. They've, pulled their punches, shall we say, but, increasingly being more pronounced with their strikes on Israel to show what they can do. Clearly, Israel does not have the air defense capability to prevent a massive strike should Iran choose to do that. They don't want to do it, apparently. So the last time they strike Israel's like, oh, we're going to get them this time. We're going to take them out. We're going to do this. And I'm sitting there thinking, but they're going to hit you back. And oh my God, what are we going to have now? Russia steps in and they're apparently providing all kinds of defensive capabilities for Iran. And as I understand it, a lot of diplomatic cover to try to work things out here. So now we have Israel. What was it? The 1st of October was the day that Iran retaliated against Israel. Here we are almost at the end of October, and Israel every single day. Today might be the day. Now we have this weird so-called intelligence leak about Israel's plan, which I am, based on history, extremely suspicious about that being an intelligence leak. It seems like a planted intelligence story. It seems like an intelligence operation. Anyway, your thoughts, and the more I read, the more it seems to me the Pentagon are the people that are trying to yank back on the reins. Obviously, they know that if this thing goes bad, we've got a lot of bases there, a lot of ships within missile range, things they understand the gravity of the situation. Your thoughts on this weird intel leak and Israel's constant barking about attacking Iran, though it seems like they may be getting a little bit out over their skis and saying that they're even capable of launching a massive strike on Iran.
Well, right now, Israel reminds me of the schoolyard bully who gets in over his head and then shouts, "Somebody hold me back. Please, somebody hold me back." Because the bully knows that he may be overdue for a pasting. And in that context, let me share with you the recent news about the attack on Mr. Netanyahu's home. Now, the preliminary analysis was that it was just a minor scrape. But if you look at the damage at that home, it was very serious. And I think that the Israelis are discovering something they should have known already, which is what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If you're going to kill the leaders of the opposition in Lebanon or in Gaza, well, you're opening the door for your leaders to be targeted. And speaking of being targeted, here's something I'd like to get your opinion of. At times, I've watched Caroline Glick, who is this Israeli hawkish commentator who speaks like many hawks with a thick US accent. And she was reporting the other day that her comrades in Washington are investigating the National Security Advisor of Vice President Harris, speaking of Phil Gordon, for alleged ties to Iran. And she says that there are other assistant secretaries in the Pentagon who are being investigated similarly. Now, I've read all the stories from the right-wing press attempting to suggest that Governor Walz of Minnesota, the vice presidential nominee, has ties to the People's Republic of China. That's a staple in the right-wing press nowadays. Right before I came on camera, I was reading yet another story ringing the changes about that. But the story about Iran was news to me. Have you heard anything to that effect?
No, I haven't. But I do have noticed that, around the election, now we're getting more, I think Russiagate opened the door to that, but there's more and more tying one's political opponents or adversaries or someone who's even a political ally that doesn't share the same policy positions. It seems to me a common tactic to tie them to whichever named adversary, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, whatever the case may be, happens to fit the bill. So that doesn't surprise me, particularly for someone of Caroline Glick's, bombastic, combative nature.
Oh, you're familiar with her?
I'm familiar with her. Yeah.
Oh, I see. I thought I was the only person who followed her.
Unfortunately, I'm not proud of it, but I know who she is.
And my line is that I watch her so you don't have to.
No. Yeah, but at any rate, so it seems I get the feeling of one of two things: that either the Israelis are waiting until after the election, or that they're doing the same. I was once in a bar with it, and this guy was in there who was like a college football player. We were in college at the time, and he threw some guy out the door. He was a big, the size of a refrigerator. And the same thing, his buddies were holding him back, and he's saying, "Don't let me go." And everybody was looking at him, literally laughing, saying, "Really? That's, really, we're gonna fight this guy." That either Iran is waiting till after the election because they really want to drag the U.S. in. We know that's their game plan.
I mean, Israel is waiting.
Israel.
Mm-hmm.
They want to drag the U.S. in. But here's the other thing: since supposedly Russia has provided these S-400 very, very advanced anti-aircraft, anti-missile systems. We know that Iran has a very, very sophisticated networked air defense system. The most embarrassing thing, and Russia has provided significant electronic warfare systems, a significant defensive capabilities. The most embarrassing thing that Israel could do is launch a failed attack on Iran and say, "Okay, we're sending in F-35s and missiles," and they get shot down. That would be their worst case. They have to be concerned that they're going into, one of the most advanced electronic defensive systems on earth, and to attack that. I mean, maybe they'll try another one of their terrorist attacks from inside using, the MEK or something inside of Iran to throw a drone around at someone. But I find it hard to believe that they would go into such a strong defensive environment, taking the chance that it could fail. And I think that was Russia's game in beefing up the Iranian defensive capabilities. Your thoughts on that, Dr. Horne?
Well, obviously, Israel is in over its head. Here you have a country of approximately 9 million trying to keep a lid on Gaza and the West Bank and southern Lebanon. At West Point and other military academies, it is recommended that nations not become involved in a two-front war. Israel is involved in a multi-front war, not only with the aforementioned Gazans and folks of the West Bank and Lebanon and Yemen and Syria and Iraq and Iran having a population about 8 or 9 times the size of Israel. Iran suspected of having nuclear capability, as Israel seems to as we speak. And so it would be understandable if the Israeli leadership was having a bad case of cold feet right now. Their way to pull themselves out of this crisis, as you suggested, is to somehow drag in Uncle Sam. But a problem there is that U.S. imperialism, as already noted, has its hands full in Ukraine. It would like to focus on China. And here they are, once again, about to be bogged down in West Asia, not unlike the debacle of Iraq beginning in 2003, not unlike the debacle concluded ignominiously in Afghanistan in 2021, which really punctured the popularity ratings of Mr. Biden with the chaotic, shambolic, and helter-skelter manner in which U.S. imperialism withdrew from that country after years of interfering in their internal affairs. And so I would hope and imagine that the Israeli leadership is mulling over these factors and considerations. But if history is any guide, they may throw caution to the wind and like the cartoon character, Admiral Wrongway Peach Fuzz, may decide to sail into the bitter winds as they throw their fate to the winds.
I certainly agree with you there. The hope that we have is that they would be rational. The historical context tells us that would be the first time if they were rational. That does not align with their history. Thank you very much, Dr. Gerald Horne. Certainly appreciate you taking your time to come on. I hope, I will contact you weekly. I hope you can, find time out of your schedule each week, and we can. There are big things going on. Hopefully next week we won't be talking about either what happened in Israel or anything crazy like that. Every week it's like, I'll put it like this. At this point, each week we're happy if we're just here the next week to talk about these things. But thank you very much. Certainly appreciate it. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Talk to you soon. All right, everyone. And don't forget, share this on all your social media platforms. I am not allowed to be on X for numerous reasons. So please share this on all your social media platforms. Also, if you can afford it, as you know, Sputnik's gone. So any help that you can contribute to the cause is highly appreciated. You can either Patreon, buy me a coffee, Cash App, the whole 9 yards. You can see PayPal all going across there. Anybody that can afford it, certainly appreciate it. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful night. Let's see. Tomorrow afternoon, I've got Dr. Ratika Desai. She's really awesome. Thursday, Scott Ritter. I think I'm going to have Andre. We're going to work on getting him. I think he says he's good for Thursday. So it's an interesting week. I got lots of, now that I'm no longer on Sputnik, got a lot of good guests coming up. Talk to you soon. I'm out.